distinct pleasure to invite my teacher, Jeremy Leigh, to our Zoom-a-thon this morning. Jeremy is the leader and organizer and coordinator of the Israel Studies and Modern Jewish History segment and department of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religions. Is it Toby? It's Toby, right?
Yeah, Toby campus.
Yeah, Toby Family Campus in Jerusalem. He's the coordinator of the Israel Seminar Program for the Year in Israel students, which really honestly changed my life, as well as the director of HUC JIR's JDC Fellowship for Global Jewish Responsibility. And he coordinates and leads the trip to Lithuania for all the first-year students. And he's really just a dynamite educator and a gentleman. And I have to tell you, Jeremy may not even know it, but he really changed my life. And he doesn't know how he did it, but I'm going to tell him right now. So, as many of you know, my emphasis all throughout undergrad, but mainly in rabbinical school, my thesis was all about memorialization of the Holocaust and looking at it through the lens of how people memorialize the Holocaust. And during our first year, Jeremy was teaching us really how to look at different spaces and how to open our minds to different spaces. And he informed me, he said, when we were walking through Yad Vashem, he said, you know, every museum, every memorial, everything has an agenda. You have to just look through it to see it. And that opened my mind into how I approached my entire thesis and my entire courses of study. So thank you, Jeremy, for that.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So without further ado, let's pack our bags, let's head to Europe, and I introduce to you the incomparable Jeremy Leigh.
Wow. So thank you, Rabbi Ziv, thank you. And it's lovely to be with you. Is this okay? Just give me the nod to say you can see fine. Okay, so so here's the thing. It's lovely to meet you. I'm sitting in my apartment in Jerusalem. We're still technically in lockdown, and all the conversation, all the idea of travel, of course, is fascinating because it's all based on an idea that that's a thing that we used to do in the olden days. It's a thing that we're going to do soon, but in the meantime, we're just going to have to do everything by virtual. And the advantage is that it allows us to jump all the way back and forth across the continent as much as we possibly can and try and tell a Jewish story. So I'm going to have to, you're going to have to bear with it, but I take it as part of the story, which is, you know, a lot of this is actually quite similar to the way that Rabbi Zav just said, which is, you know, the way that we travel. We could just do this as a kind of a vacation, in which case I'm not sure I'm really the best guy to do this. I work in the field of education. It's about trying to make meaning, to find meaning, to kind of have dialogue, have conversation. And so travel is a place for looking at things in a different kind of way. So I'm starting with this, if only to try and illustrate the point. Travel, and a lot of what I've got to say, it's all about how you look at it. If the center of your world, well, it depends. If we tend to see the center of the world being where we're sitting. So I thought it'd be good to put a map which has the center of the world is in fact Papua New Guinea. And it just lets us know that, of course, it's all a matter of perspective. And this is a very famous map that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It was made by a Reformation Protestant thinker in the 16th century. And here you can see the world is divided into continents and Jerusalem is at the center. But it's interesting because it was done by a Christian, it wasn't done by a Jew. So it only lets us into the world of knowing that actually it's all there for grabs. This takes us closer to Europe. One of my pieces of, it's a kind of piece of work that I'm involved in is with the Council of Europe, which is sort of the cultural, maybe considerably less political side of Europe, in working on developing one of their 30 roots of 30 roots of European culture. The Jewish one is the one down here. That's the one I'm involved in. And it sort of sets up the question that when one travels Jewishly, or if one travels anyway, if you travel in a European way, what do you expect to see? One of the routes, for instance, is the route of the olive tree. There's the route of the Vikings. There's the route of, and one of them is to travel Jewishly. So it's a way of begging the question, which is, what actually is Jewish heritage in Europe? Let's say we were going to Europe. By the way, this map in the middle is one of the maps of where heritage sites have tangible heritage to look at, physical things. But it begs the question, what actually we expect that to be. So here we go. We actually have less than 50 minutes. That's the map of Europe. This is what I'm asking, which is where do we go and what do we talk about when we're on the way? I'm going to start. So this is a little bit mad. We're just going to kind of jump around countries and ideas, and I hope that I don't lose you along the way. And if you do, you'll no doubt tell me and share. I wanted to start with the most optimistic thing that I could say, because I know that the story of Europe has plenty of dark edges to it. So we'll come to the dark edges quite soon, although I'm not a particularly dark-looking person in my view of Jewish history. But I wanted to start with this. When the Berlin Wall came down, the Jewish communities behind the Iron Curtain kind of found themselves in a situation of kind of asking themselves, well, I'm not sure the communities asked themselves, because the communities didn't all necessarily exist as communities. This was a kind of a ground-up project of Jews emerging in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, and so on, and met halfway by the JDC, actually, by the Joint Distribution Committee, one of the most important world Jewish organizations. And one of the first things on their agenda was to revive Jewish life. And the product of that, I mean, I'm zoning in like on this short little whistle stop tour on the best version that there is, which is the Szarvas summer camp. It's about 3 hours drive from Budapest. And you can work out from the pictures that these did not happen last summer, but they are going to happen again at some point in the near future. A revival. The Jewish community, Tchiat HaMeitim, the Jewish community coming back to life in all the images that you can see there. And the amazing thing, last word on it before we move on, just imagine a summer camp where where each 2-week period has Jewish kids coming from 2 or 3 or 4 different communities. So they might be coming from the Czech Republic, and they might be coming from Poland. What's the common language? It's not quite as straightforward as the summer camps that maybe we know and love. And of course, the common language is Jewish. The only thing that makes it complicated is that quite a lot of the kids that are coming at the beginning, not so much now, had only just discovered maybe that they were Jewish. So we're gonna stay in Hungary, because if we're already starting with something optimistic, we'll go for something a little bit more messy here. This is a picture of someone taking a picture. And I'm there really as a way to ask you this question, which is, it's about the politics of how we travel and what do we look at. We are here on the Fisherman's Bastion. It's a kind of a lookout point in Budapest on the Buda side of the capital of Hungary, looking out across the Danube River, one of the most important Jewish rivers of Europe. All the rivers of Europe are pretty Jewish because they had Jews traveling along them at various times in the distant past. But if we were to stand at this classic tourist lookout post, I would be asking you the question, what do you see? And what you might choose to go for, depending on your eye, is either of those two things. And these are literally in front of each other. One of them is the Hungarian Parliament, an incredibly important site for the Jews, because this is the parliament that grants citizenship to the Jews in the middle part of the second half of the 19th century. And yet right in front of it, where I'm waving the mouse, is where this monument is. These shoes, which are cast in bronze, as the remembrance of the Jews of Budapest that were shot to death on the banks of the Danube in 1944 by Hungarians, by fellow citizens. And as a result, when you kind of see those two images, one very optimistic, being given citizenship, and the other one very pessimistic, being betrayed, it begs the question, which is, what is the story that we're going to tell? So I'm going to stay on the optimistic track. I'm going back and forth, but if we kept going, we actually crossed the bridge and we went down into the pest side. So the modern side of the capital of the country of Budapest, we come to this, the largest functioning synagogue in Europe. I used to say it was the largest synagogue in the world because that's what someone once told me until I went to the Belzer Hasidische Shul in Jerusalem, which has room for 10,000 people. So it doesn't have that. So anyway, but this has room seating for 3,500 people. And I think the thing to say is this: it was built by Jews before they got their citizenship. In other words, it's a hell of an optimistic building. And And it's enormous. And of course, it goes through all the various stories and tragedies that you can imagine from the 20th century. But if we were going there, of course, we'd have to go there. And I'm just going to kind of hover around here a little bit, because there are lots of things that different guides talk about in there. I've never been to your synagogue, so I hope what I'm going to say is not going to be insulting, but my intention is not to be insulting, obviously. But I listen to what guides talk about, and a lot of them get caught up very much in the kind of, in like the, how many light bulbs there are, about, you know, about the internal design, because it was quite a big deal when it was made. I mean, I'm interested in that, but more my question, I think, is, do you think you could find God there? Like, do you think you could pray in a very cathedral-like synagogue, which is really the deal of what the Jews of Budapest were aiming for? This isn't a Reform synagogue. It's a Hungarian offshoot of Reform called Neolog. Staying in the area of why this is so messy, because Budapest is the capital of Hungary. Hungary is a country which has had, which has been ruled for a long time through sort of quasi-democratic elections by this chap over here, shaking hands with your ex-president. This is Viktor Orban, actually quite a strong ally of Israel, but not a particularly nice chap. And I put that in there because, if anything, what he represents is this kind of chipping away at European democracy style legacy. On the right of the screen is a monument that he was responsible for, which kind of rewrites the story of actually what happened to Hungary during the period of the Holocaust, trying to cast the role of Hungary as victims and not necessarily as perpetrators. But the place, so I threw that at you. And of course, it's a little bit ridiculous because, of course, we should pause, but I just know that I've got about 4 or 5 or maybe 7 other countries to get through. So I'm just going to keep going. And if anyone wants to pick it up, they will. I want to take it to Italy. And the reason I'm jumping from Hungary to Italy, because I wanted to start in Hungary in the present. It's one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe. I mean, France is the largest, the UK is the second, and Hungary comes in quite soon after that. But the oldest Jewish community is in Italy, in Rome. And the banks of the Tiber, we're going to go back to the destruction of the temple. The Jewish slaves taken from Eretz Israel, from the land of Israel, to the capital of the Roman Empire, and would have disembarked somewhere. I mean, I have to say, wherever you're coming from, Jewishly speaking, to stop at a place and say, could I have a conversation with someone from a different era? To talk to a Jewish slave at the very beginning of the Jewish exile, the long march that takes Jews to North America, but initially not for quite a long, not for many centuries, what would be our conversation we would have with them? Now, what we know is actually when they did get off, they actually discovered that there were Jews living in Rome from even before then. The oldest Jewish community, actually, at least in Italy, second oldest in Europe, was a group of the Hanukkah, the Hasmoneans. So when the Hasmoneans won, when the Maccabim won, they sent 2 Jews from the land of Israel to the new rising empire, which was in Rome. And they basically set up a kind of an Israeli embassy here in the Forum in Rome in the year 160 before the Common Era. And it's a remarkable thing. This is, by the way, is the temple or the tomb of Julius Caesar, who was also not a bad guy when it came to the Jews. He allowed the Jews living in Rome to send tithes to Jerusalem during the time of when the temple still stood. So we'd walk around, and of course, we would be one of only a small group of people looking at the Roman Forum through Jewish eyes. But much more typical, I think, is to hover around this, the Arch of Titus. So when those Jews got off their slave ships, somewhere in the belly of one of those ships was the menorah from the temple. And what was built was this victory arch overlooking the Roman Forum. And this really is the symbol of us as a people at our most defeated. I mean, certainly before the 20th century, at our most exiled, at our most, well, I don't know, never expecting to go home. What do we think was going to happen? Initially, I mean, again, not that many guides will point it out, but some 11,000 Jewish slaves were set to work to build the Colosseum. When I said we're looking at sites through a Jewish lens, I'm not trying to say that there's nothing else to talk about the Colosseum apart from the Jewish story. I'm just saying the Jewish story tends not to get spoken about very much. And actually, by the way, somewhere in the middle of over here, there's a large cross which is put up because lots of Christians in the early Christian church became martyrs to Christianity as victims of Rome in gladiatorial competitions and in sport. The Colosseum goes from being the icon of Rome to actually quite a clunky, difficult, awkward place to go to. Fascinating, with lots of questions. And of course, when we stick around, we realize why Rome becomes almost the iconic story of Jewish Europe altogether, because this is where, well, it's not the first ghetto in Europe, it's the second, but it's the first, the Venice ghetto, which was 1516. This is this comes about 40 years later, in 1553. This is the really nasty one. Jews were okay living in Venice in the ghetto, but Jews in Rome were humiliated and persecuted. And this really awful picture that we have here, which is that once a year at Easter time, people would come and take 1 or 2 Jews from the ghetto, put them in a barrel and do sport, rolling the barrel from the ghetto to the Piazza Navona, which is one of the big and very beautiful squares of Rome today. And quite often that Jew who was in the barrel would die or would be maimed for life, a symbol of tremendous kind of humiliation and persecution. And therefore, I mean, again, we're not dwelling on any of these. We're kind of just throwing out kind of ideas to keep our eyes open. But of course, the moment you look at this, I mean, it's another enormously big synagogue built in 1904. It lets you know that we survived. And this is the Cinque Scuole synagogue, the 5 schools or the 5 communities who made up Jewish life in the ghetto. And it really is, I mean, a kind of a neo-Byzantine style of architecture. One of the most, I mean, obviously it's entirely subjective, but in my view, one of the most beautiful synagogue interiors in Europe. And it's a hell of a thing to go back between these 2 pictures, a symbol of our humiliation, and then a symbol of the fact that we were emancipated and Jews became good Italians and fought for Italy and so on and so forth. And Jewish Rome is buzzing. I mean, you know, I wanted to put at least one food reference in because it would be just wrong. And I have to say, of all the great places in, you know, I've been guiding in Jewish Europe for 30 years. And this is really one of my favorite, not just because the food is amazing, because the bakery has been there for hundreds of years. And actually, if you, I'm going to wave my mouse here, just round the corner from the bakery, there's a little sentry box, a little guardhouse, which is where the papal guard stood to protect. Well, I don't really know. I mean, what they were protecting and who they were protecting. They were protecting the Christian world from some Jewish theology that might have seeped out through the gates. It's kind of a crazy thing. But anyway, they're gone. And the Pasticceria Boccioni, this family, the Limantoni family, have been making these things, had this bakery for hundreds of years. And by the way, I should go back to that. If anything, I mean, you could do with this session as you wish, but I'm going to put it out there. This dish that I put here, which is all available, particularly from Wednesdays through till Fridays, is pizza ebraica, Jewish pizza. It's a pastry. It's it's very rich. It's got a lot of dried fruits and pine nuts and sugar and candied peel and so on. Anyway,
Jeremy, I have a quick question for you. Actually,
of course you can. Sure.
While I'm never one, everybody knows I'm never one to say no to a pastry. But if you could go back one or 2 slides to the large synagogue in Rome. Yes, right there. So, you know, as German and other classical Reform synagogues say in America, you know, obviously the Jews of Italy were emancipated and whatnot, and assimilation became a thing, and this structure made these synagogues built like churches, to look like churches, with the pulpits completely separate, et cetera, et cetera. Did assimilation really play a huge role in how these were constructed as well throughout Europe? Like Doheny and whatnot.
Yeah. So I'm going to tweak one of the words, because there is assimilation, of course, but there's something in the middle between, which I think we would call acculturation. And for me, this is a symbol of acculturation. This is the Jews of Rome saying, We are part of the culture of the city. Now, to assimilate is to go one stage further, where we, as it were, almost disappear into the city or disappear into the culture. Whereas here it's saying it may outwardly look like it's a kind of an Italian-style, monumental, kind of cathedral-style building, but it is rich with Jewish insignia. And remember, the building is only a shell. What takes place inside is the essence of who we really are. That's our real culture. So outwardly, it is Italian in style. And there's lots of Jewish references, by the way. All of the artwork inside is classical or neoclassical in form, but rich with references to the Torah, specifically to Torah and Tanakh, to the Old Testament. And by the way, this, Reform Judaism did not really catch on in Italy at all. This is a very from Orthodox synagogue. Men and women are separate. There's a tiny Reform synagogue in Rome, but it doesn't have a particularly, it's growing, but it's always been small. And this is really the kind of the main synagogue of the community, but it attests to just how Italian they are. Maybe the last comment on what you said, because it is like the synagogue before in the Doheny, and it is like some of the larger synagogues that one might find in North America. There's a message that's coming out of this building, which says, we feel confident. We are proud of who we are, and we're not embarrassed by the fact that we can borrow, we can acculturate, because we know that the inner core is intensely Jewish. So
great.
There you go, that's them. And I've littered a few little questions out there because that's my job. I'm an educator, and our job is to kind of leave things dangling for someone to pick up. But I have to say, Rome is like the whole of the diaspora story rolled up into one city. I mean, we could do this elsewhere, but this dish, by the way, belongs to the same story, actually, because this is carciofi judaica. It's the Jewish-style artichoke, which is a kind of a part of Roman cuisine, even though it has a Jewish name. But the question I left you, which is, so from the time when the Jews arrive in Rome, all the way through their dark periods, the ghetto, the slaves, the survival, and then the emancipation, the rebuilding, and I haven't even mentioned the 1940s and their life under fascism and Nazism, this is a city which kind of poses the question, which is, what actually are the rules for successful diaspora Jewish living and life? So I'm going to leave that one there, and I'm going to move ourselves along to Spain. We're going to Spain because there's a loose chronology here. And I'm going to stop in Andalusia, which is in the capital of Cordoba, either just the bridge, but I put this one here just to remind us that this is a thing that people used to do in the olden days, like they went on vacation and without masks, they kind of behaved as we did in the olden world, and as we will at some point in the future. So these are people crossing the bridge into Cordoba, which actually was occupied by the Romans before, but really we're looking onto the story of Jews at the highest point of Spanish existence, where they were part of an Islamic empire. And the most beautiful, remarkable building is this one here. It's one of the real kind of gems it's a UNESCO heritage site of world civilization. The Mesquita, the mosque of the Umayyad dynasty of Abd-Al Rachman III from the end of the 10th century. The Christians took over and have kind of hollowed out the middle part and turned it into a cathedral. And now I think, as we live in a more balanced and happy world, you can do with that comment as you wish. It's a cathedral officially, but most people relate to it as a mosque. But it's a symbol of high Islamic art. And what's most important is to acknowledge that the people that built it were Muslims in the early period of Islam, and this is their palace on the outskirts of Cordoba. And I'm getting to the Jewish story because for me, it's one of the greatest places in the whole of Europe for telling a Jewish story. This is the Medina al-Zahara, the palace of Abd-Al Rachman III in the second half of the 10th century in Cordoba on the hillside. He kept his palace outside the city, but what's fascinating about this palace is that the second in charge was this chap over here, Rabbi Chazdai ibn Shaprut, the rabbi of the community, a man of great wisdom, and he went on to become the equivalent of the Secretary of State, not for a small little city, but for an entire empire. This is an empire that went from Cordoba all the way back across the Middle East. And it's probably in diaspora Jewish history, until modern times, the highest ranking official ever in diaspora Jewish history. He was number 2 in the caliphate. And Jews and Muslims at the time got on well. And actually, this is a really beautiful moment, by the way, because we know that it doesn't last forever. And very famously, you know, doing the job of the caliphate, he wrote a very famous letter to Jewish communities around the world, most famously to the king of the Khazars in the 10th century, saying, do you know when the Messiah is coming? Now, just round the corner, this chap was born, and there are people who try and claim that this is actually his house, but this is Maimonides, born in Cordoba in 1138. But one of the great Jewish philosophers, thinkers of all time, there's a statue by where he was allegedly born in the Juderia, in the Jewish quarter. But I want to put this up there because there's a little question there, which is, Maimonides writes many things. One of them was a work of great philosophy, the Guide for the Perplexed, which is in Arabic. He also wrote the Mishneh Torah in Hebrew, which was not a philosophical book like the book of the Guide for the Perplexed, but it was a book of how we're supposed to live ourselves according to halakha. I'm just kind of putting it out there. Tourism is about standing at places and asking questions and having conversations. So for me, the journey to Cordoba, as well as asking what was the secret for getting on so well between Jews and Muslims in the Middle Ages, which of those 2 books are you more likely to want to read? The book that tells you how to practice Judaism, or the book that discusses what do we understand in Judaism? They're both weighty tomes. I leave them to the rabbis on the call or the educators on the call to develop that one further. But we're just going to kind of acknowledge that we're on the move. And just across the way in Andalusia, when Cordoba kind of fell to Christianity, and actually the whole of southern Spain, apart from one little enclave, fell to Christianity, it was only a matter of time. And in Seville, about 70 or 80 miles away, Seville becomes the new center of Jewish life. But from 1391, with the first attack, until 1492, the Jews find themselves having to depart. And I just put in these 2 pictures of the port of Seville then and the port of Seville today, but it lets us see this. And it could just be, by the way, that we would now ask the question, if we were just following the Sephardi Jews on their journeys across Europe, just look what's happening here. Jews are spreading themselves out, and our diaspora is growing and growing. And we might ask ourselves the question whether the questions that the Jews of Rome asked themselves 1,500 years beforehand, are they the same questions that the Jews of the Sephardi Empire might be asking themselves? But just before, I didn't put the last word on, before we leave it, a Spanish question as we leave should say, what are the limits to life alongside non-Jews? We had one of the best periods of time in Spain and it fell to pieces. So what is the lesson learned? Now, I feel a little bit bad, but I was thinking this through and I was in chronology and I was thinking, you know what, a poignant of the moment site, not a banner headline, a much more hidden one, but I've taken you now to France, to Colmar, in the eastern part of France, to Alsace. And in the 1830s, when someone was renovating a shop over here on the Rue de Juif, on the street of the Jews, they burrowed through a wall. This is the synagogue, by the way. That's why I put it there. And it's round the corner. It's actually the other end of Rue de Juif. They knocked through a wall and they discovered in the wall a whole stash of treasure. And this stash of treasure has actually been exhibited around the Jewish world, and it may have come to you, I don't know, but it became known as the Colmar treasure. An almost identical story happened about 50 miles away in the German town of Erfurt. And they asked themselves, where did this treasure come from? Why was it hidden in the wall? And the answer is that there was a time when there was a terrible plague that affected the world. And people did not know how to rescue themselves from the plague. And they tried all the normal strategies. But in the end, they concluded that the reason the plague had come must be because there was something that was bad at their heart. And what was bad were the Jews. And instead of looking for vaccinations as we might now, they took it out on the Jews. And the plague, the Black Death of 1348, is what explains the treasure, because the Jews of Colmar, just before the mob attacked the synagogue, the people who lived there buried their treasure in the side of the wall. And of course, I'm going to just pose that. This is the map of where massacres took place against Jews when there was the Black Death in Europe in the middle part of the 14th century, just to say this. We're living through a world plague, and thank goodness, violence, we understand the world differently. And in a way, to stand at that spot is a way of acknowledging 700 years of past in history. Let's just think what's got better in the world, and what do we rely on now to ensure that that kind of stuff doesn't happen again? Are there rules for Jews living in a time of crisis? There's obviously a lot more to say about that one, but I want to move ourselves on. Now, this looks a bit dark,
Jeremy,
but I promise you...
Can I interrupt for 1 second? I'm so sorry.
Of course you can, Rabbi.
We took a trip to Germany as a congregation, and we decided to skip the Shum cities to go to Erfurt. And it was one of the most spiritual places we have ever been because of the story that you just told. And if anybody is ever in Europe, this is a town you must go to. Its Jewish history is rich, and it's deeply spiritual. So I just wanted to add that because I was shocked that you showed it, and it just clearly, this place is growing. I think the World Historical Society, I can't think of the name, named it as one of the sites, one of the special sites. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. And I'm delighted to hear, by the way, I mean, you know, as I get to sort of understand, you know, I'm fascinated by who travels Jewishly where, which congregations do and which congregations don't. So that's the giveaway. So this is a very sad picture because the Notre Dame Cathedral, oh, I don't know what the hell's going on here. This should say France, not Frackley. So we're here in France on the Ile de la Cité, on the island where the beginning of Paris began. And on Notre Dame Cathedral, which, as you may remember, 3 years ago, went up in smoke. And but here's the fascinating question. On the front of the building of the Notre Dame Cathedral was this, which is a statue of two figures. This one is called Ecclesia, and this one is called Synagoga. And Ecclesia is the image of Christianity, pure, virginal, stands upright and holds the truth. And this poor character next to Ecclesia is Synagoga, which is the Jews whose staff is broken, who can't see, they're blinded. Actually, in some of the variants, they have a devil's tail coming out the back. But here's my question, what is so fascinating, I mean, obviously, it's a terrible tragedy for France, for everybody, that the cathedral burned down. But just think about it. A question has to be asked. When they rebuild Notre Dame Cathedral, will they put the statue back up again? It's not, I mean, you think about all the statues that are taken down around the world today in a whole discussion about what, here they've got a perfect excuse not to put it up. And by the way, it's not just, I mean, the Ecclesia Synagoga, they're all over Europe, by the way. Strasbourg Cathedral has probably the oldest and the most famous, but it's absolutely fascinating. And I am going to pause on it just for one moment to say this, that inside the building, I don't know whether you've done a trip to Paris as well, but inside the building, the last Archbishop of France, going back, I think 3 archbishops, was Archbishop Lustiger, who was Jewish. Only, you know, the Jews have to have an archbishop. Lustiger was a Holocaust survivor. He was rescued by Catholics, and he stayed in the Catholic Church until after the war. And whilst he was the Archbishop of France, he would speak to his brother, who also survived the ghetto in Poland where they came from, who lived on a kibbutz. Kibbutznik sitting in Israel, the Archbishop sitting in the cathedral in Paris, and they would speak to each other once a week in Yiddish. I mean, I don't know how many Yiddish-speaking archbishops there are out there in the world, but the beautiful thing was that when he passed away, Archbishop Lustiger, his brother came to the cathedral, and it was totally accepted that he would, of course, mourn and grieve for his brother, and he said Kaddish, and he said Kaddish inside the cathedral. Notre Dame may have like this really ugly symbol of anti-Semitism from a different era, and anti-Semitism may be alive in Europe, including in Paris, unfortunately, but there are a lot of bright lights out there, and those bright lights are worth hanging on to because this is a period where things are out there for change. So onwards and upwards, we're moving over to Berlin, 2 remarkable images of kind of shiny Berlin since since the rebuilding, since 1989 at the end of the Berlin Wall. This is the Reichstag building. This is the Brandenburg Gate. Right next door to the Brandenburg Gate is this, which is the Berlin Monument for the murdered European Jews. And what is so interesting about the Holocaust monument inside in Berlin is that it's not a local monument. It's a monument to all the Jews of Europe that were killed. What's important, by the way, is to say this, that why did I start with these two buildings? Because when you think about your national heritage, your capital city, where do you put the monument to your greatest failure, which in the terms of modern Germany was the Holocaust? And so the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe is just to the side of the Brandenburg Gate, and it's about a 5-minute walk from the Reichstag building, from the Parliament building. It's a way of saying that Berlin has no neutrality on the Jewish question. You're tripping over Jewish wherever we actually go. And I put this in here, by the way, as if to say the following: who actually are the Jews in Berlin? So obviously you can go to the Jewish shop and you get a real sense of I don't know, of whatever the Jewish shop sells, food and other Judaica. But also these brass plaques, which are embedded in the pavement. Now, this is not unique to Berlin. It's just it has the highest concentration. What are called Stolpersteine, stumbling stones, plaques where, as we walk along, we see an individual plaque to an individual person, a Jew, who was deported from that building. And that's a way of saying that you almost stumble over the memory when you walk over them and when you walk around them. So who actually are the Jews in Berlin? The Jews of Berlin are the ghosts of the past who are very much present. And of course, they are the Jews of today. I kind of wanted to make sure that we included this because it's just too good. Particularly given our kind of connection to Reform Judaism, this is one of the oldest, it's not the oldest by any means, but it's certainly one of the oldest Reform synagogues in Europe. The Orianenberger Strasse, the synagogue on Orianenberger Street, built in 1866. It was just a few years after the Doheny Synagogue. Very famously, the Kaiser, or the rulers of the day, were present for its unveiling. This is the picture when it was opened. This is a picture since it was rebuilt. Very famously, the fire chief in Berlin saved it from destruction on the November pogrom in 1938. And as a result, it it doesn't function as a synagogue today, but is there for us to see and to acknowledge. But actually, rather than dwell on the famous one, which is where everyone goes, I wanted to go here. I'm glad I'm getting a clap there. But to the Hochschule, which is the Academy of Jewish Knowledge, which was, well, it's a kind of a precursor to the Hebrew Union College. I mean, it's a kind of a messy version of it, how it's a precursor, but it is a precursor. And it wasn't just for rabbinical studies. It was for lots of things. But the building survived. By the way, should just say that it's on Tucholsky Strasse. And at the other end of Tucholsky Strasse is the Agudat Yisrael, the ultra-Orthodox synagogue and seminary. And I have to say, if I was going there in real time, I always kind of try to make a point of not just standing and talking about the Hochschule and talking about the ultra-Orthodox at the other end of the street, but simply to ask you as the tourists, if you were there then, where would you place yourselves between those two buildings? And that means the group's got to split up and decide where they are, because maybe at the time Reform Judaism would not have been your thing. And maybe ultra-Orthodoxy also might not have been. In other words, we have opening up here the great spectrum, the great plurality of Jewish life. But anyway, to stay with the Hochschule, it produces a number of very, very famous people. The first person to mention on the left of the screen here is Regina Jonas, the first woman ordained as a rabbi. There's a controversy whether she was really ordained as a rabbi. I'm going to leave that because I think suffice to say that the position that she was allowed to take was not quite the same as the same status of rabbi, but she was ordained. Tragically, she met her death. She was deported to Theresienstadt in 1942. But she's an incredible image of a pioneer, obviously in a struggle which is, well, which is still there, which is the struggle for equality. Now, in the middle of the screen is Rabbi Leo Beck, the leader of Berlin Jewry during the 30s, who finally escaped eventually and got to London. And when he passed away, a new rabbinical seminary was established in London named after him, the Leo Beck College. And I'm saying this not to schwitz in any particular way. It's just because if I'm saying it, then I feel wrong not to mention it. But the original two students of that college, of Leo Beck College, one of them was my father, who was the rabbi in Edgware Reform Synagogue in London. And he was taught by the people who'd been studied in the Hochschule. My father was not into that particularly, but that's a different discussion. So I thought I ought to put this up here because we need to kind of stay in the real zone. I mean, when I said, who are the Jews of Berlin? Berlin is the #1 kind of default option for Israelis who don't want to live in Israel anymore, or who do want to live in Israel, but want some time out. So the Israeli community in Berlin kind of hovers between 10 and 20,000. That's quite a big diaspora for Jews in Europe. And I just found this picture. This is part of an artistic production, some play. But it seemed to be interesting, and therefore I thought it would make a nice slide to put up. But I want to say this, which is Berlin is very Jewish. It may not actually have that many Jews. The Jewish population of Germany is kind of, is back up to pre-war numbers, but that's largely as a result of immigration from the former Soviet Union. But whether it's the Chabad Chanukiah in front of the Brandenburg Gate or the interior of a conservative synagogue on the Riechstrasse, which was the one synagogue that was open during the period of communism in East Berlin, Berlin is a city sort of where you're breathing Jewish pretty much everywhere. And therefore I wanted to kind of include this on the front of the Reichstag building, on the front of the Parliament building. Okay, that was right at the beginning of this little section. We have these 17 letters making up 3 words, which says, Dem Deutschen Volk. This is almost the manifesto of the Parliament. And it was actually put up there in the middle of the First World War. And it means for the German people, for the German folk, for the German nation. But those letters actually were cast in bronze from a factory and gifted to the Parliament by the people who own the foundry, the Lowy family, or if you want to kind of go before their name got Germanized, the Levy family. These were German Jews who donated the branding of the Reichstag building. Jews who give to Germany those letters that said for the German nation. It's a hell of a moment, I have to say, particularly, by the way, because Jews were fighting for Germany during the First World War when this happened. But anyway, as we pause on Berlin, again,
Jeremy, before we leave Berlin, I have a question for you. I was just in Berlin last year, and so I know a little bit more of the answer to this, but I'd love to hear you explain it. Can you briefly tell of the geography and the demographics of Jewish Germany, say 1961, East versus West, primarily, and then where are the Jews still living now all throughout? Would you consider them to still be quote unquote Eastern, or more on the Western end of things?
So first of all, I mean, it's obviously it's a topic for kind of a whole long piece, because we have to ask the question, which Jews go back to Germany after the Second World War, after the Holocaust? That is really the question. And very, very few. And those who do are in themselves just really the most fascinating people, because conversations, and again, I am sort of aging myself here, but conversations with Jews before 1989 in Germany, the conversation really only ever began by the other person, whether you started speaking or not, having to kind of apologize for the fact that they live in Germany, which is, you know, I'm not going to say ridiculous, but I kind of just always made me feel bad. There were 101 reasons why post-Holocaust life took them where they did. So the majority of Jews who were there in Europe when Berlin was kind of still run by zones of the Soviets, the British, the Americans, and the French, most Jews got out of East Berlin as quick as they possibly could. And that's why the majority of Jews of Berlin in 1961 were on the western side. There was a small group on the east, and they actually managed to keep their community going in the Riechstrasse Schule, which is what I showed you there. now, today, we are 1.5 generations since that. And Berlin has developed in so many other ways that actually there's a logical reason why Jews have moved to the East is because it's cheaper. And if you move there in the 90s and then gentrification kicked in, it was a double win. You got a cheap property and you're still living in the, but now your property is worth a lot more since it's gentrified. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say the majority of Jews still in Berlin live on the Western side, but actually, and here maybe it's for me, I think an interesting thing to think about, the municipality of Berlin and actually the country as a whole, the capital as a whole, have tried to reconfigure the entire center point of their city to say that the city, the center, now has to be somewhere which did not belong to one or the other, so to speak. So to kind of configure the whole of the center of the city, and that's basically what's happened.
Right. Thank you.
But I think it's fair to say that the Reform Synagogue which is sort of the larger of the, I mean, there aren't so many Jews in Berlin, and certainly not so many who affiliate towards synagogues. That's very much on the Western side, in the area where the more middle-class bourgeois Jews lived before the war.
Right, great. We have about 5-6 minutes.
I mean, if anyone wants to ask anything in the chat, then you can tell me. Otherwise, I'll just keep. I'm just going to keep traveling. But no one should feel intimidated.
Well, I think one person's interested is the question that you have on the screen here. What is the right balance between?
Oh my goodness! No. My job as the educator is just to ask the smart-ass questions. It's not to answer them. No. So, I mean, I think the answer is. I mean, and actually, it's. So, Rabbi Ziva, I have to say, you will remember this, and I'm guessing. Because we would have studied this, I think, on Israel Seminar, but Berl Katznelson very famously in a piece, was a Zionist cultural figure who died in 1944, but he very famously said is that, we're made up of these two faculties, to remember and to forget. But if you only do one and not the other, then you lose your personality or you can't move through life. You have to kind of work out the balance. And identity is actually the point at which you've worked out the appropriate balance between remembering and forgetting. See, one could go to Berlin in the mode of certain Jewish travelers who go from Holocaust site to Holocaust site to Holocaust site and do that all the way through Europe as well. And then there are others, by the way, who do the opposite and say, let's only concentrate on the present because we don't want to deal with the difficult and dark past. And you could probably work out, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this. For me, it's all about the balance. And I don't know there's a formula, but I just think that the conversation is what keeps us alive. And the other thing to say, without being too kind of cliched about it, that's why we leave Egypt every year. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've left Egypt quite a few times in my life now. And we keep leaving it because we keep trying to work out what it is that we're trying to work out between remembering and forgetting. Maybe, by the way, this is a different way of saying it. And I know this looks like a very dark picture to focus in on, but it's very hard to do a Jewish tour of Europe without knowing that we have to kind of deal with Holocaust full on at some point. But I wanted to say this, going on the railway tracks that lead into the gas chamber, or leads into the area where the site of Birkenau used to be, I put it up here. There is a tendency, a lot of Jews come here, of all the places where Jews travel in the world. I mean, this is just my field. The majority of Jews travel basically to one of two countries, to Israel or to Poland. One represents in some way life and the other one represents death. I don't like any of that. Israel has enough death, and we also have a lot of other things to talk about apart from life and death. And Poland has a huge amount of life to talk about as well. But acknowledging that we're going to come here, I want to pose, this question. If you stand on the railway tracks at the entrance to Birkenau, my question is absolutely, which direction do you think you ought to be standing? And what I mean by that is, do you think that the question that you've come to Poland to look at is going to be answered inside the site of a death camp? Or is the question going to be answered actually the other end, at both ends of the track? So actually I'll stand with my back to Auschwitz and I'm going to look back across the whole of the continent of Europe where euphemistically we've come from. What happened to us as a people that allowed us to be in a situation whereby such a terrible thing could happen? And that's not about blaming us, that's asking the questions of all the countries of the world that we've been to. But I do want to say, because I whizzed past it, just remember, in the same way that we came to Rome and we've got a Jewish baker in a hell of a shawl and so on. There's a great JCC in Warsaw, and you get a great Shabbos dinner in Krakow. And there's amazing things that are happening Jewishly in Poland. It's not the Jewish community from before the war. It's got a lot more in common with lots of other Jewish communities around the world. But it reminds us that this journey is all about acknowledging that, the story never quite, thankfully, seems to be entirely over. And I'm going all the way back. You can see what's happening here. We're going back to the beginning. The Arch of Titus. It is May the 15th, 1948. And very famously, on the day after the state of Israel was proclaimed, the Jews of Rome, and by the way, American Jewish soldiers who were stationed in Rome, gathered at the Arch of Titus in order to walk backwards. Because what they were saying was, let's go back in history and say, Roman Empire, where exactly are you now? Because you know what? We Jews, we are actually still here. Now, this isn't some kind of triumphalist kind of shallow patriotism that doesn't have any thought behind it. It's just a matter of saying to ourselves as a people, this journey around, a continent which has done some bad things to us, at the end of the day, we actually are here, and we do still appear to be here in a whole number of different places. I mean, we're there at the Arch of Titus. I put in, the most sacred site of all, which I apologize is not Congregation Shir Malot, but it's Shuk Machane Yehuda in Jerusalem, the food market in Jerusalem, which for me is the place where the Jewish people live more than anywhere else. And please God, when the pandemic, whatever passes, we'll all be able to go back there. So I've kind of got to there are a couple of extra slides, but I've got to the end of the time that we have, and I know you've got other stuff to do. So I'm going to pause it there. I don't know if there's time for anyone who wants to put in a last comment. Rabbi Ziv, if you want to put in a last comment.
Jeremy, this was outstanding. Outstanding. You mentioned the JCC in Krakow. I loved Krakow when I was there. And, I was alone on my trip. Nobody was with me. And I walked right up to the JCC on Shabbat, and I was like a rock star in there. A rabbi coming and seeing them, and it was a great dinner, and people were dancing. It was a blast. There were 300 people. It was in the middle of Poland, and it was really extraordinary. And I thank you for taking us on this not only historical, but really enjoyable trip to see that Jewish life is confident. Jewish life is strong. It's vibrant in Europe, and that's something I think we all yearn for. And that's really extraordinary.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you to you, Rabbi Ziv. Thank you to Rabbi Steinberg. And thank you all of you. Thanks for inviting me. I hope the rest of your this amazing thing that you're doing, I hope it keeps going, and I hope you have a great day.